Stop begging for love and reclaim your self-worth with a powerful Stoic mindset. In Stop Begging for Love, Choose Yourself First Stoic Glint, discover how self-respect, boundaries, and inner strength transform the way others see you and how you see yourself. Learn to stop chasing validation and start building a life rooted in confidence and clarity. Subscribe now to Stoic Glint for more insights on mastering your mindset and living with purpose. What if the real reason love keeps slipping through your hands has nothing to do with how much you care, and everything to do with how much of yourself you have been giving away? One of the most painful truths a man can face is realizing he was never simply loving deeply. He was begging for love in ways so subtle he barely noticed. Not on his knees, not with desperate words, but through the quiet surrender of his dignity, replying instantly every time, apologizing even when he had done nothing wrong, accepting disrespect, silence, and emotional distance just to avoid losing the person he wanted to keep. At first, it does not look like weakness. It looks like loyalty. It looks like patience. It even looks like love. You tell yourself you are just being understanding. You tell yourself real love means staying, forgiving, trying harder. But over time, something begins to change. The harder you cling, the less valued you seem to become. The more you reach, the colder the response feels. And then one day, that uncomfortable thought hits you like a whisper you cannot ignore. Why am I the only one fighting this hard to keep this alive? That is the brutal truth many men learn too late. Love rarely grows where self-respect is absent. More than 2,000 years ago, the Stoic philosophers warned about this exact trap. They understood that when a man places his worth in someone else's hands, he gives away the very thing that makes him powerful, his inner authority. He stops standing firmly in who he is and starts shaping himself around the hope of being chosen. In this video, you are going to see the Stoic principles that help a man reclaim his dignity, stop chasing validation, and become the kind of man who never has to beg for love again. Because here is the paradox. The moment you stop begging for love is often the exact moment people begin to recognize your true value. Most men do not wake up one morning and decide to abandon themselves for a relationship. It happens quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. In the beginning, it looks like effort. You text first because you care. You apologize first because you want peace. You give more time, more patience, more understanding because you believe that loyalty means never giving up on someone. And for a while, that feels noble. It feels romantic. It feels like proof that your heart is real. But there is a line many men cross without realizing it. A thin, dangerous line between commitment and self-abandonment. Once that line is crossed, the energy of the relationship begins to shift. Maybe it starts with something small. A comment that feels disrespectful. A dismissive tone. A moment that stings more than you want to admit. You notice it. You feel it. But instead of addressing it, you brush it aside. You tell yourself it is not worth the argument. Not worth attention. Not worth the risk. Then it happens again. A canceled plan. A cold message. A moment where your effort is met with indifference. And again, you stay quiet. Why? Because somewhere deep in the background, a fear has started to grow. What if speaking up pushes them away? What if setting a boundary costs me the relationship? And once that fear enters the room, everything changes. You become more careful, more accommodating, more willing to overlook things that once would have bothered you. Not because you are weak, but because you do not want to lose the connection. And that is the moment so many men fail to recognize. The moment effort quietly turns into approval seeking. The moment love stops being expressed from strength and starts being driven by fear. Marcus Aurelius warned about this nearly 2,000 years ago when he wrote, "Never value anything as profitable to you which compels you to lose your self-respect." Think about how sharp that truth really is. If keeping someone in your life requires you to shrink your standards, silence your discomfort, or tolerate behavior that wounds your dignity, then what you are protecting is no longer love. It is attachment. And not healthy attachment, but attachment fueled by fear. And fear erodes something every man needs if he wants to be truly respected: his dignity. This is the hard truth many men eventually discover. The moment a man becomes afraid to lose someone, he often begins to lose their respect. Not always because the other person is cruel, but because human nature instinctively responds to confidence, self-possession, and clear boundaries. When a man respects himself, you can feel it. It shows in his voice, in his posture, in the standards he refuses to betray. But when he fears losing someone, his energy changes. He explains more. He tolerates more. He accepts less than he deserves. And that change rarely goes unnoticed. And this is where everything begins to shift. The moment a man starts accepting less than he once would have, something quiet but powerful begins to fade: respect. At first, it's almost invisible. Nothing dramatic. No clear turning point. Just small compromises. A boundary you ignore. A moment you let slide. A standard you quietly lower. But over time, those small moments begin to add up, and without realizing it, you are no longer standing in the same strength you once had. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed that a man's first responsibility is not to control others, but to govern himself, his emotions, his reactions, his principles. Because the moment your peace depends on someone else's approval, you are no longer in control of your inner world. You've handed that control away. And that is why the Stoic path begins with a truth that is uncomfortable, but necessary. No relationship is worth the cost of your self-respect. Think about that for a second. If keeping someone in your life requires you to silence your voice, ignore your values, or shrink who you are, what are you really holding on to? Because yes, you might keep the relationship for a while, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to lose something far more important. You begin to lose respect for yourself. And once that happens, something even harder follows. When a man stops respecting himself, the world eventually mirrors that back to him. Now this leads us to a difficult but important realization: the brutal truth about desperation. Desperation doesn't show up loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly, disguised as effort, as care, as trying harder. But beneath it, there is a shift in energy. And that shift changes everything. Not because people are intentionally trying to hurt you, but because human nature responds to strength, to confidence, to clear boundaries. When a man is grounded in his own life, you can feel it. He has direction. He has purpose. He has standards that are not easily shaken. And because of that, his attention has weight. It means something. It's not given freely to anyone at any time. But when a man begins to center his entire emotional world around one person, something starts to change. Slowly, he becomes more available, more accommodating, more eager to please. At first, it may look like kindness. It may even feel like love. But over time, the energy shifts. Instead of being a man who chooses, he becomes a man who is hoping to be chosen. And that difference, is everything. Imagine this clearly. Two men. The first has built a life he respects. He has goals that matter to him. He has discipline. He has friendships, purpose, direction. When he enters a relationship, it adds to his life. It does not define it. The second man slowly revolves his life around the relationship. His mood rises and falls with every message. His confidence depends on attention. His peace depends on whether someone stays or pulls away. Now ask yourself honestly, which man is more likely to be respected? The Stoics would say the answer is obvious. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly. Look within. Within is the fountain of good. What he meant was simple, but incredibly powerful. When a man builds his sense of worth from within, he becomes far less dependent on the reactions, approval, or validation of others. And that independence creates something rare, a grounded presence. Because when someone senses that you don't need their approval to feel whole, your attention becomes more valuable. It's no longer something you're giving away, it's something you're choosing to offer. But when your happiness depends on how someone responds, they feel that pressure, even if nothing is said out loud. And pressure rarely creates attraction. It creates imbalance. Here's the hard truth many men struggle to accept. Giving more effort does not always lead to more appreciation. In fact, effort without boundaries often has the opposite effect. It lowers perceived value. Not because your effort isn't meaningful, but because when it comes from fear, it sends a silent message. I need you more than you need me. And in relationships, that imbalance slowly erodes respect. The Stoics taught that a wise man does not cling to what he cannot control. And no matter how deeply you care about someone, there are things you will never control. You cannot control whether they value you. You cannot control whether they stay. You cannot control how deeply they feel. But there is something you can control, and it is far more powerful than all of those things combined: your standards, your actions, and your self-respect. When a man anchors himself in those, something begins to change. He stops chasing validation. He stops over-explaining himself. He stops trying to convince someone to see his worth. Instead, he lives in a way that naturally reflects it. And here's the paradox. This is often the moment people begin to see him differently. Because the man who no longer chases attention becomes the man whose attention suddenly matters the most. And this is where that shift becomes undeniable. The moment a man stops chasing validation, he starts rebuilding something far more powerful: his dignity. In Stoic philosophy, dignity is never something you demand from other people. You don't argue for it. You don't prove it. You don't beg for it. It's something you build quietly, internally, through the way you live, the way you think, and the standards you refuse to compromise. And once a man truly understands that, something begins to change in how he approaches relationships. He no longer moves from fear or desperation. He moves from a calm, grounded place of self-respect. This leads to a powerful idea the Stoics deeply valued: why people respect the man who can walk away. Now, walking away is often misunderstood. Many men hear that and immediately think it means giving up, being cold, or acting indifferent. But that's not what it really means. Walking away is not about rejecting someone else. It's about refusing to abandon yourself. Because think about this for a moment. What happens when a man believes he cannot lose someone? Something inside him tightens. He becomes trapped in that belief. And slowly, he starts accepting things he once would never tolerate: disrespect, broken promises, one-sided effort, not because he lacks strength, but because he is afraid of what will happen if the relationship ends. And once fear takes control, something even more important disappears: his freedom. The Stoics believe that freedom is one of the most valuable things a person can have. Epictetus said it clearly: "No man is free who is not master of himself." Now apply that to relationships. If your emotional state depends entirely on someone else, if your happiness rises and falls based on whether they stay, reply, or show attention, then your inner world is no longer yours. And when a man loses control of his inner world, he slowly begins to lose his power. But something very different happens when a man understands that he can walk away if necessary. His behavior changes, subtly but powerfully. He no longer feels the need to over-explain himself. He no longer chases reassurance. He no longer tolerates behavior that violates his standards. Instead, he carries himself with a quiet certainty, not arrogance, not hostility, just clarity. The kind of clarity that says, without words, "My dignity is not negotiable." And that clarity changes everything. Because people can feel it. They may not be able to explain it, but they sense it. When a man values himself, it shows. His words carry more weight. His presence feels grounded. His decisions appear firm and confident. But when a man is afraid to lose someone, his actions begin to signal the opposite. He becomes overly agreeable, overly available, constantly trying to keep the peace, even at his own expense. And over time, that imbalance reshapes the relationship. The respect that once existed begins to fade, not always intentionally, not because the other person is trying to diminish him, but because respect grows where boundaries exist. And boundaries only exist when a man is willing to walk away from what violates them. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He reminded himself again and again that the opinions and actions of others were never within his control. What he could control was his own character, his standards, and his response to life. And when a man adopts that mindset, something powerful happens. He stops trying to control how others feel about him. He stops trying to earn approval. Instead, he focuses on becoming someone he respects. And once that shift takes place, the fear of losing people begins to fade. Because he realizes something deeper, something most people never fully understand. Anyone who requires him to sacrifice his dignity in order to keep them is not someone he needs to hold on to. That is the quiet power of walking away. It restores balance. It restores freedom. And most importantly, it reminds a man that his value was never dependent on someone else's approval in the first place. And from here, we arrive at the next realization: choosing yourself is not weakness. It is the beginning of real strength. And this is where that realization deepens. Walking away is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of choosing yourself. Many men struggle with this idea. They believe that putting their own growth, their standards, or their peace first will make them look selfish, arrogant, or uncaring. So instead, they try to prove their value the only way they think they can, by giving more time, more attention, more emotional energy. They sacrifice quietly, hoping it will be noticed, hoping it will be appreciated. But over time, something unexpected begins to happen. The more they neglect themselves to keep someone else happy, the less respected they begin to feel. And the reason is simpler than most people want to admit. People naturally respect those who respect themselves. It's not something you can fake. It's something that shows up in your behavior, your boundaries, and the way you carry your life. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology ever explained it. They believed that before a person can build anything meaningful with others, he must first learn to govern his own life. Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." At first, that might sound like it's about physical courage, about facing danger or hardship. But the Stoics often meant something much deeper. The courage to stand by your principles. The courage to say no when something feels wrong. The courage to walk away from situations that slowly drain your dignity. Because real strength is not always loud. Sometimes, it is the quiet decision to stop abandoning yourself. When a man truly begins to choose himself, his life starts to look different. Not dramatically at first, but steadily. He no longer structures his entire day, his mood, or his identity around another person's attention. Instead, he begins investing his energy into building a life that stands on its own. He develops discipline. He focuses on meaningful work. He strengthens both his mind and his body. He surrounds himself with people who respect his standards instead of testing them. And gradually, something important shifts. Relationships are no longer the center of his identity. They become part of a much larger, more stable life. This shift matters more than most people realize. Because when a relationship becomes the center of a man's entire emotional world, even the smallest things begin to feel overwhelming. A delayed message suddenly feels like rejection. A canceled plan feels like abandonment. A moment of silence turns into overthinking. Everything becomes amplified. But when a man has purpose, structure, and direction, his emotional balance becomes stronger. He still values connection. He still enjoys being with someone. But he no longer depends on that connection to feel whole. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly. He wrote, "Look well into yourself. There is a source of strength which will always spring up if you will always look." The Stoics believe that real stability does not come from outside circumstances. It comes from within, from character, from discipline, from living in alignment with your own values. And when a man builds that internal foundation, something powerful begins to happen. He stops chasing validation. He stops trying to convince people to see his worth. He no longer feels the need to explain himself endlessly. Instead, his actions begin to speak for him. Quietly. Consistently. And that kind of quiet confidence changes how people respond to him. Because confidence built on external approval is fragile. It rises and falls based on how others react. But confidence built on self-respect is stable. It doesn't shake easily. It doesn't collapse under pressure. It remains steady, even when things around him are uncertain. This is why choosing yourself is not selfish. It is responsibility. It means protecting your time, protecting your standards, protecting the direction of your life. It means deciding that your peace is not something you trade for temporary approval. And interestingly, when a man begins living this way, relationships often improve, not because he is trying harder, but because he is no longer entering them from a place of need. He is no longer asking someone to complete him. He is inviting them to be part of a life that is already meaningful. And from this place, we begin to understand the next idea, one that is often misunderstood, but incredibly powerful. The silent power of detachment. And this is where the idea becomes even clearer. Choosing yourself is not about becoming distant, it's about becoming stable. Many people misunderstand what detachment really means. They imagine someone cold, someone who doesn't care, someone who pulls away emotionally from everyone around them. But that is not what the Stoics were teaching. Detachment is not about shutting down your emotions. It is about refusing to let your emotional stability depend entirely on someone else's actions. A detached man can still care deeply. He can still love, still invest, still commit. But there is one crucial difference. He does not build his entire sense of peace around whether someone stays, replies, approves, or validates him. Why? Because he understands something fundamental about life. People are not fully within his control. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." And when you bring that idea into relationships, it changes everything. Because no matter how much you care about someone, there are things you simply cannot control. You cannot control whether they choose you. You cannot control how they feel. You cannot control their level of commitment. And the more a man tries to control those things, the more frustrated, anxious, and unsettled he becomes. But when a man begins to practice detachment, something shifts. His behavior becomes calmer. He stops analyzing every small signal. He stops reading too deeply into every message, every pause, every change in tone. He no longer chases reassurance or tries to manage how others perceive him. Instead, he focuses on the one thing that has always been within his control, how he shows up in the world. And that shift changes the entire energy of the relationship. A man who constantly seeks validation often appears tense, uncertain, even restless. He overthinks conversations. He questions silence. He looks for meaning in every detail. But a man who is grounded in himself moves differently. If someone chooses to stay, he appreciates it. If someone chooses to leave, he accepts it. Not because he doesn't care, but because he understands that his worth is not determined by someone else's decision. And that understanding creates something incredibly rare: calm confidence. It's not loud. It's not performative. It doesn't need to prove anything. But it's felt. And that calm confidence has a powerful effect on how others respond. Because most people are used to relationships driven by emotional reactions, arguments, reassurance seeking, constant need for validation. But when they encounter someone who remains steady, composed, and self-assured, the dynamic changes. The need to control fades. The need to constantly seek approval disappears. And what replaces it is something much healthier: mutual respect. The Stoics believe that true strength does not come from suppressing your emotions, but from understanding them. Not from becoming cold, but from becoming stable. When a man develops that kind of emotional discipline, he no longer chases people out of fear. He simply lives with clarity about who he is and what he stands for. And from that place, relationships begin to feel very different. They are no longer desperate attempts to hold onto someone. They become calm, balanced connections between two people who both have the freedom to stay or to leave. And paradoxically, it is that freedom that often creates the strongest connections. Because when there is no pressure, no fear, no desperation, what remains is genuine choice. And this naturally leads to the next realization: becoming the man who never needs to beg. At some point, many men reach a quiet moment of reflection. They look back at their past relationships and begin to see a pattern. Moments where they tried too hard. Moments where they ignored their instincts. Moments where they accepted less respect than they truly deserved. And slowly, the truth becomes clear. It was never a lack of love. It was a lack of self-respect. The Stoic philosophers believe that the goal of life is not to control others, but to master yourself, your thoughts, your reactions, your character. Because when a man becomes disciplined in those areas, something powerful begins to happen. And this is where the transformation becomes real, not just in what a man understands, but in how he begins to live. At a certain point, something inside him shifts. He no longer looks outward, asking, "Do they value me?" Instead, he turns inward and asks a far more important question. Am I living in a way that I respect? That single question changes everything. Because now, his focus is no longer on being chosen. It is on becoming someone worth respecting in his own eyes. And when a man begins to respect himself, his life starts to take shape in a very different way. He builds structure. He creates direction. He invests in his own growth, not for approval, but because he understands it is his responsibility. He strengthens his body. He sharpens his mind. He develops discipline in his habits, even when no one is watching. And perhaps most importantly, he begins to surround himself with people who elevate his standards instead of lowering them. Slowly, almost quietly, his identity begins to change. He is no longer the man chasing approval. He becomes the man living with purpose. And what's interesting is that this transformation is not loud. There are no dramatic announcements. No need to prove anything. It happens in silence, through the small decisions he makes every single day. Choosing discipline when comfort feels easier. Choosing growth when distraction is tempting. Choosing dignity when validation is within reach. Marcus Aurelius captured this idea perfectly when he wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." The Stoics believe that character is not something you talk about. It is something you demonstrate. It is revealed through action, through consistency, through how you live when no one is paying attention. And when a man begins to live by strong principles, something begins to settle within him. He becomes more grounded, more stable, less dependent on reassurance. He no longer feels the need to convince others of his worth, because his life itself becomes the proof. And as that happens, something subtle begins to shift in how others respond to him. Not because he demands respect, not because he forces it, but because respect is naturally drawn to those who embody it. It's almost as if people sense the difference. The calm, the certainty, the quiet confidence. This is why the Stoic path leads to a kind of independence that is both powerful and peaceful. A man still values relationships. He still cares deeply about the people in his life. But he no longer feels incomplete without them. He understands something most people overlook, that no person can give him the stability that only his own character can create. And once that foundation is built, everything changes. He no longer approaches relationships from fear. He approaches them from choice. He chooses people who align with his values. He chooses those who respect his standards. And if someone cannot meet those standards, he is no longer afraid to move forward. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Because at its core, Stoic wisdom is simple. It is about becoming the kind of man whose value is not defined by who stays, or who leaves. And this brings us to something even more practical. Understanding these ideas is powerful, but the Stoics believe that philosophy means nothing if it stays in your mind. It must become action. It must become habit. It must become part of how you live. Marcus Aurelius didn't write his thoughts as theory. He wrote them as reminders to himself, daily tools to shape his character. And in the same way, real change does not happen in one dramatic moment. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens through small decisions, repeated consistently. That is why the Stoics placed so much emphasis on daily discipline. Not to make life rigid or cold, but to build a strong inner foundation. A foundation that holds steady even when life becomes uncertain. So instead of looking for a quick fix, what they offer is something far more valuable, a practice. A way to reconnect with your standards, one day at a time. And this is where the real reset begins. And now, it's time to turn everything you've learned into something real, something you can actually practice. Let's begin with day 1. Stop chasing attention. Take a moment and really notice how often you reach for validation without even thinking. Sending that extra message. Checking your phone again and again. Waiting, hoping, feeling that quiet tension when there's no reply. For just one day, don't try to fix it, just observe it. See the pattern clearly. And instead of giving your energy away, bring it back to yourself. Focus on your work, your goals, your growth. Ask yourself, what could change if your attention stayed where it truly belongs? Day 2. Pay attention to actions, not words. People say many things, especially in relationships. Promises, explanations, excuses. But the Stoics understood something simple and powerful. Character is revealed through action. Watch what people do, not just what they say. Are they consistent? Do their actions align with their words? Because consistency will always tell you the truth more clearly than any promise ever could. Day 3. Establish one clear boundary. Think of one situation in your life where something has been bothering you. Maybe it's small. A broken promise. A lack of respect. A repeated behavior that quietly drains your energy. Instead of ignoring it again, decide, calmly, clearly, what you will no longer accept. Not with anger. Not with frustration. But with certainty. Because boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about defining yourself. Day 4. Invest in yourself. Shift your focus. Instead of wondering whether someone values you, start building a life that you value. Exercise. Learn something new. Create something meaningful. Even small improvements matter. Because every step you take toward growth strengthens something inside you, your confidence, your discipline, your sense of direction. Day 5. Practice saying no. This is where many men struggle. Saying yes feels easier. It avoids conflict. It keeps the peace. But every time you say yes to something that goes against your standards, you weaken your own authority. So today, practice saying no when something doesn't align with your priorities. Not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly. Because every no that protects your values is actually a yes to yourself. Day 6. Reduce emotional dependence. Notice how your mood shifts based on someone else's attention. A message arrives, you feel relief. Silence, you feel uneasy. Why does your peace depend on something so unpredictable? Today, take that power back. Remind yourself that your emotional state should not rise, and fall based on someone else's response. Stability begins when your peace comes from within, not from a notification. And finally, day 7. Write this one sentence. Take a moment, slow down, and write it clearly. My value does not depend on who chooses to stay in my life. Read it again. Slowly. Let it sink in. Because this simple sentence holds a deep truth. You can care about people. You can love deeply. But your dignity must never be tied to someone else's decision. The Stoics believe that the strongest people are not the ones who seek approval, but the ones who build their lives on principles. And when a man begins to live this way, something powerful happens. He stops chasing out of fear. He stops shrinking himself just to keep someone around. And without forcing anything, he begins to attract relationships built on mutual respect. There is a shift, a quiet but powerful shift, the moment a man stops begging for love. He stops chasing validation. He stops abandoning himself. And instead, he begins building something far stronger, self-respect. Because real strength was never about controlling others. It was always about mastering yourself, your thoughts, your standards, your direction. And when you truly learn to choose yourself first, something changes. Relationships are no longer something you cling to out of fear. They become something you enter with clarity, with dignity, with choice. And the truth becomes simple. The right people will never require you to beg for their attention, their care, or their respect. So if there is one idea you carry forward from this, let it be this. Become the man who respects himself first, and you will never have to beg for love again. Thank you for watching. And if this message resonated with you, stay with us for more insights on building a strong and disciplined Stoic mindset.